In the words of the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. But is that promise in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence a reality for all or just for some? Welcome to the first episode of Bankole's Nation. I'm your host, Bankole Thompson. This podcast will be a weekly examination of some of the most important issues shaping our nation, the state of our democracy, the quest for equity and inclusion, the quest for personal transformation. In the words of the great late Dr. Miles Monroe, the wealthiest place on the planet is just down the road. It is the cemetery. There lie buried companies that were never started, inventions that were never made, best-selling books that were never written, and masterpieces that were never painted. In the cemetery is buried the greatest treasure of untapped potential, according to Dr. Miles Monroe. We will examine the quest for personal and social transformation, bringing you stories of empowerment. We'll also look at, of course, the journey, the long walk to freedom and justice, and of course, those who are left behind in this democracy. On Bankole's Nation, we will look at all of the issues that are shaping the lives of our communities, issues that impact you. You'll also hear voices that disagree with me on these issues because we need to hear all shades, all sides of the debate. We'll be right back after this break as we begin the inaugural edition of Bankole's Nation. Stay with us. Welcome back to Bankole's Nation. I'm your host, Bankole Thompson, and thank you so much for joining us in this inaugural edition. The inaugural topic is In Search of a Fiery Conscience, which is a play on the title of my latest book, Fiery Conscience. There's been a growing number of companies around the nation who have been scaling back their commitment to DEI in the wake of the vicious assault that we're seeing across this nation regarding the push or the insistence on diversity, equity, and inclusion across this nation. Some companies, in fact, are being targeted by activists because of their embrace of LGBTQ rights, have decided they will scale back on DEI. Most recently, we have seen Ford Motor Company, Toyota North America, being the latest relating to the auto industry, who have indicated that they're changing their approach, scaling back their overall commitment to DEI and changing those policies. We don't know what those policies, what kinds of policies they plan to change, but the mere fact that Toyota North America, the mere fact that Ford Motor Company is willing to publicly announce that it was looking back or planning on scaling back its commitment to DEI raises some fundamental questions about whether these companies are truly committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, despite the propaganda that we've seen around the nation. That diversity, equity, and inclusion simply means that we have to promote those who are not qualified, looking at individual based simply on their skin color and gender as opposed to their merit and qualification is wrong. DEI simply means giving those who have historically been disadvantaged an opportunity to compete fairly with their white counterparts, pushing, promoting qualified Blacks and Brown folks to the highest levels of corporate opportunities and corporate power. That's what DEI basically means. And now that Ford Motor Company, now that Toyota North America has joined the ranks of other companies who are now saying, well, we're going to scale back because of this embrace, because we're being targeted, perhaps by activists who are threatening lawsuit over LGBTQ rights, it raises an important question about Ford Motor Company, about Toyota, about those other companies around the country. Do they truly believe in the redeeming and enduring power of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And if they so believe, then why isn't Ford Motor Company willing to go to court in a court of competent jurisdiction to defend diversity, equity, and inclusion? Why isn't Toyota North America willing to go to court in a court of competent jurisdiction to defend diversity, equity, and inclusion? Think about it. These are billion-dollar companies that are reaping billions of profits. And of course, their consumer market includes Black and brown people who are buying these products, who are shopping these products. So what message is Ford Motor Company sending to the world, to the nation, when it issues a public statement of that magnitude? What message are they sending to Black consumers? What message are they sending to brown consumers? What message are they sending to consumers who embrace, who believe in the redemptive power of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And when we look at the auto industry, it has had its own version of what we'll call the long walk to freedom. It was not always diverse. Once upon a time, there were virtually no African Americans on the boards, on the corporate boards of these companies. If we go back to the 1970s, when the late Reverend Leon Sullivan, the minister out of Philadelphia, who came out of Abyssinia Church in New York to Philadelphia, Zion Baptist Church, headed the largest Black church in Philadelphia. Reverend Leon Sullivan led one of the most successful, remarkable boycotts of companies in this nation, when he boycotted several companies in Philadelphia that were refusing to hire Black people, again, under the pretext of we can find qualified and competent Black people to hire. Reverend Sullivan led a boycott that opened opportunities, the floodgates of opportunities for Black people. Reverend Leon Sullivan in the 70s, became the first African American to join the board of directors of General Motors. And by so doing, he became the first Black person ever to be on the board of directors of a major corporation in this nation. He was not only a civil rights leader, he was an anti-apartheid icon. And so that started the opportunity to give more Black people their overdue opportunities within the auto industry. And he became a towering voice on the board of directors of General Motors. Not only did he push for equitable policies towards Blacks in the auto industry, but he also led the anti-apartheid campaign that successfully forced General Motors to pull out of a racist apartheid regime in South Africa. That was the Reverend Leon Sullivan. By so doing, Reverend Sullivan made it clear that the auto industry ought to understand that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And of course, the Reverend Jesse Louis Jackson, civil rights leader and founder of the Rainbow Push Coalition, took on that mantle of Reverend Sullivan, underscoring the significance of the Black consumer market. The General Motors, Ford Motor Company, Stellantis, Toyota, all these companies ought to demonstrate not only respect towards their Black consumers and brown consumers, but must embrace equitable policies that will advance not only these communities, these companies, but the community as well. So decades after Reverend Sullivan sat on General Motors' board of directors and gallantly championed equity, justice, and freedom in the corporate boardroom, Ford Motor Company is now signaling to the public that it wants to scale back its commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Somebody at Ford Motor Company ought to read the history books. Somebody at Ford Motor Company ought to understand what it took the nation to get to this level. Somebody at Ford Motor Company ought to be reminded that it took a very long time for us to get to where we are. Somebody at Ford Motor Company, at Toyota North America, and these companies ought to be reminded that some of the gains of the civil rights movement were won in court, in courts of competent jurisdiction. That's the history. So why is Ford Motor Company afraid of going to court to defend DEI? Why is Toyota North America or any other company that is planning on scaling back, why are they so apprehensive or seemingly apprehensive to go to court to defend DEI? If they truly believe in the redeeming power of diversity, equity, and inclusion, these companies ought to have no problem whatsoever to defend diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we have to be able to make it clear to these companies that, in fact, by signaling that they're scaling back from their full commitment to DEI, they're sending a very wrong message, a very bad message to the rest of the nation. We're living in a period where we need conscientious business leaders. We need conscientious companies who are willing to write justice with black ink on white paper. We need companies who ought to be reliable allies in the modern struggle for freedom and justice. Just because of a threat of a lawsuit does not mean that these billion-dollar companies who are reaping billions in profits should simply back away from doing what is right, should simply back away from embracing policies that are in sync with their diverse consumer market. It is unacceptable. And we should state that very clear. It is unacceptable for these companies at this juncture, when the nation is at the crossroads and questions are being asked, who in the nation is willing to demonstrate that it has a fiery conscience? Who at Ford Motor Company? Who at Toyota North America? Who at any of these companies are demonstrating that they have a fiery conscience in the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr.? And if they do, then we ought to see that commitment. We ought to see that commitment reflected in the embrace, in the full embrace of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and not backtracked. So far, the signals we are getting from the signal towers of the corporate boardrooms of these companies, is that they're willing to drop diversity and run away. And Ford Motor Company ought to ask itself, how will it want history to remember its legacy? How would Toyota North America and the other companies who are running away from diversity and equity and inclusion, how would they want history to remember them? When we look back at the last 5 decades, we look at what was gained, the battles that were fought. We looked at leaders of institutions who decided to do what was right. You know, in the past, I've shared the story here. In fact, I shared that story in a keynote lecture I gave for Brown University about the late Dean of the Washington National Cathedral, Reverend Francis B. Sayer Jr., who invited Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to deliver what would become his last sermon at the Washington National Cathedral. Reverend Sayer faced an existential question. a Shakespearean existential question to be or not to be. He chose to be with the civil rights movement. He led a delegation of clergymen and women from Washington, D.C. to Selma, the cradle of the civil rights movement. And so Ford Motor Company, Toyota North America, and all these other companies also are facing the same or a similar Shakespearean existential question to be or not to be. And Ford Motor Company ought to tell us, Toyota North America and these companies ought to tell us whether they're going to be with the modern struggle for freedom and justice, at the center of which is full diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll be right back with more on Bankole's Nation.
Hip-hop has been a reflection of culture and society.
That includes stories of struggle
and pain,
social injustice, racial inequality, the marginalization of communities. Today,
we confront a healthcare system
that has been rigged against all of us.
Hospitals force patients to sign contracts for services
without ever showing us actual prices,
stifling competition,
overcharging without accountability.
And if we can't pay, these same contracts
allow them to take everything we own,
creating so much fear that millions and millions of Americans refuse to enter a hospital,
putting our health and our lives at stake.
This is an American humanitarian crisis.
We love our nurses,
and we need our doctors,
but hospitals and insurers rigging a system to make profits off of people that's in struggle is unforgivable.
We demand prices
and transparency in healthcare.
Power to the patients.
Welcome back to Bankole's Nation. I'm your host, Bankole Thompson. Thank you so much for joining us on this inaugural episode of our weekly podcast looking at the state of our democracy, the challenges of equity and inclusion, of course, stories of personal and social transformation, and of course, more importantly, issues that are impacting your own communities and how your lives are being shaped by the issues, all of which will be tabled here on this program. And of course, that we are only 29 days away from, perhaps 27 days away from the consequential November's presidential election between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. In fact, in that regard, this campaign 2024 has received perhaps one of its most stunning surprises, if you will. The mayor of Hamtramck, its first Democratic Muslim mayor, Ahmed Ghalib, has come out in support of former President Donald Trump for president. Mayor Ghalib has indicated that he believes that Trump is the right choice for the nation at this critical time. And of course, his endorsement is coming over his disagreement with the Democratic Party or the posture of the Biden administration relating to the war in Gaza. Mayor Ghalib met with former President Trump recently in Flint, Michigan, days after which he will come out in a full-throated endorsement of the former president, saying he believes he's the right choice for this critical time. It's quite an irony, though, because former President Donald Trump has vowed to bring back the Muslim ban. And here you have a Democratic Muslim mayor lining up behind the president, perhaps the first president in modern history to orchestrate, to institute, to bring to reality a Muslim ban when he became president in 2016. President Trump campaigned on a Muslim ban. And when he got elected in 2016, he did exactly what he said he was going to do. And of course, 8 years later, we have the nation's first Muslim mayor of an all-Muslim city government in the city of Hamtramck, Michigan, coming out in support of a president who promises to bring back the Muslim ban over the war in Gaza. Mayor Ghalib is casting lots. He's gambling his political opportunities. He's betting that Donald Trump will deliver what the Biden administration has not been able to deliver, and that is a ceasefire in Gaza. But here are some serious questions that we want to ask of this mayor of Hamtramck. What makes him think that former President Donald Trump will deliver on his promises. He has not explained when he said Trump is the right choice for this critical time. He has not explained what that means. And of course, I should note that there are several Arab American Muslim leaders who have come out suddenly disassociating themselves from this endorsement by Mayor Ghalib of Hamtramck. Notwithstanding, the endorsement will go in the history books because he's the first leader of an all-Muslim city in the nation to put his stamp behind Trump. And this reminds me of a similar episode that took place in 2016. When Donald Trump got elected in 2016, the Chaldean community in Southeast Michigan were publicly asking for support, publicly asking other communities to stand with them to protect some of their family members who were refugees that the administration was going after. And in that process, they admitted that they supported Trump in 2016 for president. The Chaldean community was humiliated by the Trump administration. 8 years later, looking back at this moment and in this era, in 2024, is Hamtramck's mayor, Ahmad Ghalib, setting his community up, setting himself up for another humiliation in view of the fact that Donald Trump has promised to bring back the Muslim ban if he gets elected in 2024. I can understand the disagreements with the administration of President Joe Biden, the disagreements with the political posture of the Democratic Party. But the idea that Donald Trump is a better choice than Vice President Kamala Harris raises a lot of questions that have not been explored in this process. It raises a fundamental question regarding who has the temperament to become president, who has empathy to become president. When Trump introduced the Muslim ban, was that a demonstration of empathy? Was that a demonstration of empathy towards a community that admitted during that time that it supported Trump? And Mayor Ghalib of Hamtramck has indicated that he has no regrets. He won't have any regret for his decision and is ready to face whatever the consequences are for it. The other side to this endorsement that perhaps has not been explored is whether it has the potential to impact the alliances that sometimes are created among communities that are underserved. The Black and Brown alliances, the alliance between the African American community and the Arab American community. I remember an incident or a situation back in 2015 when there was a push to invite Syrian refugees to Michigan. I remember very well the late Oakland County Executive L. Brooks Patterson was vehemently opposed to Syrian refugees coming to the city of Pontiac in Michigan. And I recall writing a column, almost a reality check, telling L. Brooks Patterson to back off. I remember sitting with Pontiac's mayor, Deidre Waterman at the time, to discuss this issue of the refugee crisis. I even wrote in my Detroit News columns about the fact that Jesus himself was one time a refugee. And I was of course trying to underscore the hypocrisy of the evangelical right movement. And in that process, I convened and hosted the only town hall in support of Syrian refugees in Michigan in 2015. The town hall was held in Dearborn, the largest concentration of Arab Americans in the nation. And on the panel was the late Detroit Congressman and civil rights hero John Conyers. On the panel was civil rights leader, the Reverend Jesse Jackson. And I remember it so well. Arab American leaders were very grateful, very, very grateful for that alliance, for that show of commitment, that show of stand in solidarity in explaining the humanity of Syrian refugees, that they were no different, that all are created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that all human beings are born free, equal in dignity and right. The town hall in Dearborn addressed a fundamental issue. It talked about our shared humanity. And of course, this was held a year before Donald Trump got elected and instituted a Muslim ban. So as you reflect on the 2024 election, think about the decision made by Hamtramck's Muslim mayor, Ahmed Khalid, over the war in Gaza. Think about what his endorsement means in this era and what it says about the state of our democracy, the state of our politics. Given his nod to a man who vowed to bring back a Muslim ban, that would, no question, have an impact on his own community, on his own constituents in Hamtramck. What does it say about leadership? What does it say about politics? There's so many questions that come to mind when you reflect on that endorsement. That has not been explored. And it goes beyond just dismissing it as the decision of one mayor. Now, when he was elected mayor, the first Muslim mayor leading an all-Muslim government, it was a national story. It is significant. It is significant. And then in that regard, his endorsement of Donald Trump is very significant. And we'll see how much that would mean for his community if Donald Trump were to be elected.
So that was sheer panic. I could look out my window and see the current. There was water coming from underneath my door. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped in my apartment. It was scary. I thought I was going to die. After living in Florida for 50 years, I have never seen anything like this. This was the worst storm yet. So I came here, and lo and behold, there was the trailer outside with the Red Cross and the signs, and I walked in, and they were immediately wonderful to me. They gave me water, they gave you blankets, anything that you need. A safe, clean place. The meals twice a day are amazing. I couldn't be happier. The guys who are in the facility right now, the Red Cross team, they have been amazing. They have bent over backwards to make sure that we have enough to eat, make sure that we have enough to drink, in any way that they can accommodate us. And that if there's one thing that I can pass on to people, you call the Red Cross. They would take care of you. The American Red Cross does it right.
Welcome back to Bankole's Nation. I'm Bankole Thompson. Thank you so much for joining us in this inaugural edition of our weekly podcast, looking at all issues that are in the public domain that are of legitimate public interest, as well as issues relating to the state of our democracy. Recently, I was at the National Press Club of Washington, co-moderating a forum on the state of the Senate race with former White House spokesman Robert Wiener. We invited U.S. Senator Gary Peters, soon to be the senior senator from Michigan. Gary Peters, who is currently the chairman of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, to speak to us at National Press Club, and also take questions from the media relating to the state of the Senate races around the nation, targeted races. And of course, I want to also talk about right now the Senate race in Michigan, the race between Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin and former Republican Congressman, Democratic Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin, and former Republican Congressman Mike Rogers. A most recent poll indicated that Rogers is cutting into Slotkin's lead. That would not be a surprise because, as a matter of fact, this race is up for grabs. I have maintained from day one that either of these candidates could win this Senate race, no matter what the polls are saying. I think the best polls are the polls that show up on election day. I mean, individuals who show up on election day to vote. But as it relates to the Democratic flag bearer, Congresswoman Slotkin, and there's been a lot of talk in the political grapevine in Detroit and around Auburn, Michigan, in terms of what the extent of our Auburn outreach has been. To date, I am not aware of the extent of that outreach. Certainly in the past, when I would reach out to the campaign, they will send a statement and talk about the issues she's championing and how those issues reflect Auburn needs or the urgency of addressing issues of equity in Auburn communities. But one thing that we know is very clear in every Michigan Senate race in the last couple of cycles that have taken place here, whenever the race is tight, whether it was Senator Gary Peters or outgoing U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow, it's always been the Auburn vote that has rescued both Senator Peters and Senator Debbie Stabenow. In fact, on 2 consecutive elections, Senator Peters defeated Republican John James. Senator Debbie Stabenow defeated Republican John James in Detroit. The Auburn vote always makes the difference, which suddenly leads to the question. If you're watching this podcast, if you're listening to this podcast, does the Slotkin campaign, do they have an organic Auburn outreach strategy? Does the Slotkin campaign have a strategy to get Auburn voters out, to ensure that she can defeat Mike Rogers? Now, you may take that question for granted, but most recent history says you'd be a fool to take that question for granted. And it requires more than just a candidate showing up to a fish fry. It requires more than just a political candidate showing up to a house party, laying out an Auburn agenda, laying out an agenda that includes Black Michigan, the challenges facing Detroit, the challenges facing Flint, the challenges facing Benton Harbor, the challenges facing Pontiac, the challenges facing Saginaw, the challenges facing every anchor of Black existence here in Michigan. Now, the conventional wisdom or the conventional analysis is that, well, if you're running for the U.S. Senate, it's a statewide race, well, you can't just limit your campaign to one community. Well, here's the deal. In Washington, when I was co-moderating the forum featuring U.S. Senator Gary Peters at the National Press Club of Washington, in fact, I cited this in my column. Senator Peters made that very clear that U.S. Senate candidates they have to campaign as if they're running for mayor. They have to localize their campaigns. They have to relate so that they can relate to the issues of the various communities whose support that they're enlisting. And of course, that's something that, I've always talked about. That's something that I've always raised with candidates who are running, whether it's statewide or local, but more importantly, statewide. If Congressman Slotkin, with only 27 days to go in this race for the U.S. Senate, with only 27 days to go, has she explored the challenges that are facing the city of Benton Harbor, Flint, Detroit, and other communities that remain invisible here in Michigan? And any candidate would be making a politically fatalistic mistake to ignore the urban vote, to simply reduce the urban vote to a relationship with hand-picked gatekeepers in the Black community. We saw that playbook with Hillary Clinton's campaign, when the former presidential candidate and Democratic standard bearer in 2016 was confronted by Black Lives Matter activists asking her to apologize. She basically said she didn't have to apologize. Almost 1 million Black voters sat home. They didn't come out. Who came out for Obama did not come out to vote. The Clinton campaign, I recall very well, took Michigan for granted. After then presidential candidate Bernie Sanders won the March primary of that consequential 2016 election, Clinton campaign was not in Michigan because the campaign largely depended on its relationship with some hand-picked Black gatekeepers. Congresswoman Slotkin cannot make that mistake. Cannot make that mistake. If she wants to win the race for the U.S. Senate from Michigan, Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin will have to go into the trenches in this few weeks left to talk to real people, engage real people, engage those who are the bottom of the economic scale, whether they're in urban Michigan or rural Michigan. I think part of the problem sometimes that Democrats tend to have an amnesia when it comes to elections. They forget where their strength is. They have a tendency to ride off the base, a tendency to expect that people will have no choice but to come around anyway. And that's the conversation that takes place all the time in the Black community. Well, where are Black people going to go? They have nowhere else to go. Well, in 2016, we saw what happened. Suddenly, elections do have consequences. And it's incumbent on the campaign. People have to come out and vote, but the campaign has to give voters a reason to come out and embrace their candidates. And so when the most recent poll indicated that Slatkin's lead is being reduced by Republican Mike Rogers, certainly that's a warning signal that this is a race that is up for grabs. And that we may wake up the day after the election and find out that this race was really up for grabs. And that's the reason why the Black vote matters. It mattered in the election of Senator Gary Peters. It mattered in the election of Senator David Stabenow. It mattered in the statewide elections. It mattered in the election of Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Black voters cannot be taken for granted. Black communities cannot be taken for granted. And as Senator Peters indicated in my conversation with him at the National Press Club of Washington recently, that Senate candidates have to speak to local issues. They have to understand what those issues are. They have to know what the challenge is in each community. You can nationalize a race and talk about the national issues, but sometimes you run the risk of undermining your own campaign when you fail to speak about the local issues in the communities in which you're seeking support. That's why the political maxim says all politics is local. All politics is local. To expect that any given community would render their support to you without any expectations is simply to act like a runaway horse with no wisdom. Any modern candidate, any modern political candidate running for office ought to understand the challenges of inequality that are facing Auburn, Michigan. And Democratic Congressman Elissa Slatkin is not an exception to that rule. She owes it to Black Michigan. She owes it to Auburn voters to speak to their issues. And it's not late to do so in the few weeks leading up to this election. If anything, the tightening of the polls should send a message to not only Slatkin, but the entire Democratic apparatus that, in fact, this election could go either way. And let me be clear, we can wake up the next day after the election and we have either Congresswoman Elissa Slatkin as next U.S. Senator or either Congressman Mike Rogers, former Congressman Mike Rogers, as the next senator. It's that simple. It's that simple. Hence the reason not to take the Black vote for granted. We'll be right back with more of my reflection, this time, and of course, on the Democratic Standard Bearer, Kamala Harris, Vice President of the United States, running as the first Black woman President of the United States. Stay with us for more on Bankole's Nation.
I'm not on my parents' health insurance anymore, and I work for myself doing a bit of everything. So I found a plan for just $34 a month.
All plans cover doctor visits, prescriptions, emergency care, and more. Healthcare.gov is here for you. Enroll by December 15th.
Welcome back to Bankole's Nation, and thank you so much for staying with us for the final segment of today's inaugural edition of this weekly podcast, looking at all of the issues challenging the state of our democracy, issue of equity and inclusion. And of course, we'll also be sharing stories of personal and social transformation on this program to motivate and inspire our listeners as well. Just a final reflection here. Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris's campaign has gotten a lot of excitement. I've seen a lot of excitement on social media, on all the social media spaces, but it's going to require more than that for Kamala Harris to be elected the next president of these United States. It's going to take getting bodies out to the polls, getting people out motivated, excited to be in the streets to really drive this campaign home. My advice to Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign is that they should convene a major rally in the city of Detroit. And by that, I mean, don't fly into Detroit and have a rally at the airport, which was what she did. That's okay. That's fine. But I remember in 2008, having a front row seat in that historic campaign of former President Barack Obama, when I conducted a series of exclusive sit-down interviews with Obama. I remember one of the heralding campaigns that Obama held in Detroit was right in front of the Detroit Public Library, a major rally in the city of Detroit. Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign should have a major rally in the city of Detroit, not on the outskirts of Detroit, not next to the airport, not next door to Farmington Hills, but right in the middle of Detroit. In as much as the vice president is going around crisscrossing the nation, and she was here in Flint, was in Redford and so forth, motivating people to come out, she needs to also engage. She needs to be in the heart of the largest Democratic base in the state of Michigan, which is Detroit. Again, I repeat, Vice President, Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris needs to campaign in the middle of the city of Detroit, right in the city of Detroit. Thank you all so much for staying with us for this inaugural edition of Bankole's Nation. I'll see you for another episode.